Thank you very much. Well, it's a great pleasure to be here today and to welcome all of you to talk about these critically important issues. You've heard a lot about the reasons why the MEK should be delisted as a foreign terrorist organization. You're aware of the grave risk that the residents at Camp Ashraf are in and some of the steps that need to be taken to protect them. I'd like to talk a little bit not only about those issues, but also about the strategic interest of the United States and what I think our policy should be to achieve the specific objectives that we're most concerned about today, but also to ensure the long-term security of the United States and our friends and allies around the world. The fact is that the regime in Tehran today has all of the characteristics of a continuing, permanent threat to international peace and security. It seeks weapons of mass destruction. It supports, in fact, it is the central banker for international terrorism. And this regime is one of the most brutal repressors of its own people anywhere on the planet. 3 strikes and you're out. This regime needs to be overthrown, and that should be the policy of the United States. Now, you know, regime change is a controversial policy. We've got a mixture of Republicans and Democrats here today. Within the past few months, you know, we just accomplished regime change in Libya, and I'm proud of that, too. That's the way the United States has to lead. I can tell you, I had the responsibility, I was one of the people who negotiated with the government of Libya back in 2003 and 2004 to eliminate their nuclear weapons program. Can you imagine what would have been happening the past 6 months or so if he still had a nuclear weapons program? But he forfeited whatever legitimacy we gave him by the steps he took to suppress his own people and by his threat to return to international terrorism. The fact is there are some regimes whose behavior ultimately will not change. They're not going to be affected by the outside world. They're not going to reform, because to do so would mean changing the regime itself. And I think that's the nature of the regime in power in Tehran today. We've tried a lot of different steps over the years to get this regime to conform to international norms in the area of nuclear weapons and many others. And they've all failed. We've tried diplomacy and negotiations with the regime. Let me do a little verb declension. Negotiations with the regime in Tehran over its nuclear weapons have failed. Negotiations are failing. Negotiations will fail. We've tried sanctions. Economic sanctions. Economic sanctions have failed, are failing, and will fail to change the regime's behavior. Now, this is all very unattractive, no doubt about it. We don't want to contemplate the use of military force against Iran's nuclear weapons program. But as Senator McCain said back in 2008, if your choice is between looking at an Iran with nuclear weapons and looking at strikes against its nuclear weapons program, there's no question that you have to look at the military option. I think there's a way to avoid getting to that point, however, and that's to overthrow the regime. And the sooner we do it, the less likelihood that the regime will have achieved nuclear weapons first. Just because the options are unattractive doesn't mean you have to pick one of them. If you fail to pick an option, you will have a regime in Tehran that has nuclear weapons. And if that's unattractive, imagine what the reaction will be. You think you can contain and deter this regime with nuclear weapons? I don't think so. I don't think the calculus they have is the same as we had during the Cold War with the Soviet Union. And even if it were, who wants to live under threat of nuclear annihilation? The focus of our policy has to be to stop the spread of nuclear weapons. And the very grave risk, the near certainty in my view, is that if this regime in Tehran gets nuclear weapons, Saudi Arabia will get nuclear weapons, Egypt will get nuclear weapons, Turkey will get nuclear weapons, and perhaps others as well. So that in a relatively short period of time as these things go, 5 to 10 years, you could have half a dozen nuclear weapon states in the region. And that is a prescription for danger and instability and ultimately for nuclear holocaust. So what do we do? What do we do in response? Well, I think the first thing we do is decide that assisting the opponents of the regime in Tehran is in our national interest. Now, there are a variety of ways to do this. We want to be very careful that we don't give the regime the argument that somehow we're subverting the people of Iran. That's obviously not our intention. We don't want to taint anyone with our assistance. But the concern that the regime would use our assistance for propaganda is not an argument to do nothing. The regime's going to claim we're aiding the opposition whether we are or not. They've already done that. Look at what they did in the summer of 2009 following the manifestly fraudulent elections there when the people went out into the streets to protest.